Hi, this is Anna Ziai, and you're listening to UC3P.
Welcome to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. This is UC3P, our eponymously named podcast on policy, politics, and current affairs. My name is David Raban, and I'm the production manager for what we like to call the main page. Today, we talk with Liz Dozier, the founder and CEO of Chicago Beyond. Chicago Beyond is a philanthropy working on youth equity in the city of Chicago. We spoke to Liz Dozier about her success in transforming educational outcomes as the former principal at Fenger High School in Chicago, and how she's applying her lessons to reconceptualize philanthropy and social impact research. No notes today, so let's get straight into the interview. Without further ado, here's the CEO of Chicago Beyond, Liz Dozier.
Welcome to UC3P, the University of Chicago's public policy podcasts. My name is Sowmya Karun.
And my name is Yash Kirkire.
And we're here today with Liz Dozier, the founder and CEO of Chicago Beyond, an impact investor investing in disruptive, community-centric organizations and causes to transform youth living in fragile communities. Liz, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
We want to deep dive into one of your earliest successes, which was as the principal of Fenger High School here in the south side of Chicago. During your tenure, you and your team saw really dramatic improvements. Dropout rates went from 19% to 2%, graduation rates almost doubled, arrest rates within the school dropped from 300 to less than 10. You achieved this through what you call a holistic approach. And I'd love for you to comment a little bit more on what this holistic approach was and whether, for instance, the new Chicago teachers contract that guarantees more social workers and nurses, etc., is in the right direction.
So thank you again for having me. I'm just really excited to be here and to have this conversation with both of you today. I think first and foremost, it really wasn't my success. It was really our success as a school community. There were so many students and teachers and family members and just public officials who really rallied around our school to allow us the runway to really get to those numbers that you described earlier. I think for us, in terms of the holistic approach that we applied eventually at Fenger, it had to do with the basics of just being human. We saw that our kids, our young people were dealing with immense traumas. I mean, just every single day, whether it was just walking to and from schools and some of the things that were happening in the neighborhood, to things that were happening at home. And I don't want to apply this negative lens to it, but it is a lens of trauma that was really happening in a lot of our children's lives. And so for us, we couldn't just isolate that and say, they have to deal with that outside of these four walls of the school, because those things followed them in their backpacks, if you will, inside of the classroom. And so for us, it was really to root in restorative justice. It was to root in anger management and grief counseling. It was about, social workers. It was about nurses. It was about how to train teachers and how to deal with trauma. I mean, it ran the gamut of all those things that a human being needs to be successful, and then just organizing the infrastructure around that. I think that's what led to the success that we saw at Fenger High School. I want to put a little asterisk by that, though, because I think that it is those things as we think about what happens in a city, right? So it is about social workers, and it is about nurses, and it is about counselors. But it is that and some, right? We can't expect to apply, a couple of positions in a building and somehow everything gets solved and that numbers begin to shift in the aggregate. It really does boil down to how do we support a whole community? People are whole people. They don't live in isolation. And so I think that's the really important point here.
So the recent strike by the Chicago Teachers Union was a culmination of the movement that began right across the political divide. The strikes began in Arizona, West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, then to the cities of LA, Denver, and now finally Chicago. This has been described as a growing movement and a strategy by teachers to not just demand extra pay, but also to focus on social justice issues. So what do you think, firstly, has triggered this movement? And do you feel this is the only path for teachers to get the necessary policy changes that they desire?
It's interesting. I'm a former teacher.
Yeah.
I was a math teacher for 8th and 9th graders for almost like 5.5 years. And as a former teacher, like, you're really on the front lines. I mean, you really do see it all. You're a part of a bureaucracy, right? You're a part of a school system. And so you see it from that lens. But you're also like right there in a community with kids and with parents and seeing what people face. And a lot of what we're seeing, I think, in today in schools is they're outgrowths of some of the things that are happening in society. So, for example, medical care and how kids are able to access medical care, or how to deal with like different traumas that may exist in the home. And so I think as a teacher, or just as an empathetic human being, right, seeing those things in a classroom or seeing that in a child, you want to have a way to influence and a way to change. And I think there are several ways to do that. I mean, one is simply just going to the ballot box, right? Who is in office and who makes these decisions. But there's also this immense, power within a union to really negotiate and to advocate on a whole. And I think that people are being really strategic and smart about that for kids and for communities ultimately.
And that's actually a great segue into our next question, which follows on what you did after your stint as a teacher and a high school principal. You founded Chicago Beyond, which is a venture philanthropy and an impact investor. We know that you're releasing a book next year called Whole Philanthropy, based on Chicago Beyond's approach to impact investing. What does whole philanthropy mean? And could you tell us a little bit more about that?
We're going to release a publication next year called Whole Philanthropy. It is really in parallel with a recent publication we released in May of 2019 called Why Am I Always Being Researched? And Whole Philanthropy really has to do with how we as philanthropists, or those who function in the philanthropic circles, how we should show up in our work. And at Chicago Beyond, I mean, it's based on our own learnings. Like, we've tried to show up in solidarity, in consciousness, and in true connection with communities. And that's different. I think oftentimes as we think about philanthropy, it's really about charity. And there's a different way when you show up in ways that aren't based in charity, but are truly based in justice. And that is what Whole Philanthropy is based in.
This looks like a good place to take a break. We will be back after the promo. Stay close.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
And now we're back with Liz Dozier, the founder and CEO of Chicago Beyond. Liz, another important component of your work at Chicago Beyond has been research. We know that a lot of Chicago Beyond's projects are tied up with a research study. Why was this important to you as a philanthropy?
That's a great question. This is really the beyond in Chicago Beyond. And so as we think about our work happening in Chicago and we think about resources flowing, there's the resource, obviously, of dollars. There's also the resources of the talent, the actual physical, like, human beings who work at Chicago Beyond, who partner with our nonprofit partners to help them do the work, i.e. build out infrastructure, strategic plan, all those types of things. But there's also, I think, this important currency as we think about research that can also be useful to our partners. Now, not all of our investments are rooted in research, but a lot of them are. And that's because the reality is that if nonprofits don't have the data, it becomes harder for them to ultimately make the case to a funder or to a school or to whoever, like, what really is this particular program doing? How do I know that? How does the person know who's investing? How do they know that this is actually going to make a difference in a child's life? But unfortunately, a lot of the nonprofits can't afford a $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 research project to prove out their ideas. And at Chicago Beyond, we've been fortunate to be able to have the resources to identify incredible programs, but then to also give them that currency, if you will, of having a research study or project behind them. And we thought that was really important for them to be able to use that, to leverage that, to help their organization ultimately reach more young people. We've also noticed in our 3 years of existence at Chicago Beyond and having, partnered with research institutions across the country, that there is ultimately on all sides, both the funder, the nonprofit, and ultimately the researcher, there's bias inherent in how each one of those three entities show up. And so there's been some great learnings for this last 3 years that we published recently in Why Am I Always Being Researched, that doesn't say that research is bad, right? But the idea is that if you believe research drives decision making, which I think we can all agree to, you really have to care about how it's done. And again, that is important because that's how things go beyond. That's how they really ultimately take root.
How successful have you been in tying this research and this really high quality evidence that the organizations that you're supporting are collecting to the broader policy making process, both at a local level or maybe at a state level? And what are the challenges I'm sure you must have faced challenges. So what are the challenges that you have faced while doing this?
I think we'll start with the challenges. I think that's the easiest one to sort of just kind of rattle off, unfortunately. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this too, though, with the transition from actually the practice of something, and then how does it inform really big policies? And so we're still wrestling with this. One of our recent investments is in Lawndale Christian Legal Center. And so if you're from Chicago, you're familiar with the west side of Chicago and specifically the Lawndale community. And Lawndale Christian Legal basically not only provides legal services for young people, but then also provides holistic wraparound supports. So for example, if a young person is housing insecure, or food insecure, or is dealing with substance abuse issues, whatever those things are that potentially may have even gotten that child to sit in that seat to be sitting with an attorney, they are really trying to work all those angles to help provide relief and a path forward for a young person. But it's a complete reorienting of how we think about the legal system. Typically, legal system is, you're charged with something, you show up into court, then you're kind of, that is what it is. And there's a verdict of some sort, and you're either exonerated or you're not. But Lawndale believes it's a critical inflection point. How do we really utilize that to reduce recidivism? And they've shown incredible results in terms of reducing recidivism. And so we're using that, and we're partnering with the state's attorney's office to take a look at what could that look like at scale. What could that really look like if this was how we thought about just the legal system as a whole? What if it wasn't just this very isolated point of go into court, go out of court? And so what that looks like ultimately, I don't know. We'll see. We're still in the process of that actual study. So that's, I think, something that, again, that we wrestle with. I think in the immediate term, as we think about, policies and practices, procedures, all of those things, part of what we've tried to do is to ultimately influence people's thinking and understanding of their own bias around what they use to ultimately make decisions. And people, we'll just use research for an example because we were just talking about it, but, people would oftentimes, they'll assume that if something has come out from a research institution that it is true, that is the gold standard, that is ultimately the truth, not realizing some of those questions and assumptions that even got us to what the answer were inherently flawed, and who was deriving those, and who was asked the questions, and how were they asked. And so, that was part of us putting out Why Am I Always Being Researched, to help just influence how people think, because policy, in my mind, is driven ultimately by stories. It's stories that we tell one another, like us. We're having this conversation. There are stories that I tell, and there are stories that you will tell, and that ultimately drives this narrative. And those